Before smartphones, soft beds, or the hum of electricity, there was a different kind of life. One shaped by paper walls, wooden sandals, and the quiet authority of unseen rules. A life where the wind through the rice fields marked the hours, and survival required more than strength. It required perfect obedience, unwavering patience, and the endurance to do it all again the next day. Tonight, we'll gently step into that world, into the daily reality of feudal Japan. But this isn't a story of samurai duels or cherry blossoms. This is the quieter, more sobering truth of what life was really like. And why, if you were suddenly dropped into that world, you probably wouldn't last a single day. Before we begin, if you enjoy calming journeys into overlooked corners of history, I invite you to subscribe to Ancient World Unknown. It helps this quiet channel grow and ensures you never miss a story when you need it most. Now, wherever you are, whether you're winding down for the evening, lying in bed, or simply looking to slow the mind, take a deep breath. Let your eyes grow heavy. Dim the lights. And allow yourself to drift gently into a different time. Let's begin. In feudal Japan, the concept of morning was less about alarm clocks and more about survival. For the vast majority of people, peasants, laborers, and lower artisans, the sun's first light wasn't a gentle invitation to start the day. It was a demand. The rooster's crow might echo through the quiet thatched villages, but your body already knew it was time to move. And if you were still lying on your straw mat when the work bell rang, chances were you'd already fallen behind on tasks that would determine whether or not you ate that evening. Imagine it now, you awaken not to the sound of a calm melody from your phone, but to the sharp, cold air slipping through paper-thin walls. Your bedding is a thin layer of straw or old fabric laid across a wooden platform or dirt floor. If it's winter, your breath is visible. If it's summer, the insects have already begun their buzzing chorus. There is no indoor plumbing, no sink to splash your face. You would need to walk outside to a communal well, cold water stinging your hands, just to rinse off the grime from a restless night. And you would not be alone. Others are up, because the village rises as a unit. In many rural areas, families were expected to be outside tending fields or beginning their chores well before the sun had cleared the horizon. Your first task might be feeding a few chickens, repairing a broken tool, or walking down a narrow path to a rice paddy that is partly flooded and thick with mud. Breakfast was not a leisurely event. There was no hot coffee, no toaster, no sugary cereal. Instead, you might eat a small bowl of rice, perhaps with pickled vegetables or leftover miso soup if you were lucky. And that was only if the harvest had been good, if your taxes weren't too high, and if the weather had been kind. If not, breakfast might be skipped altogether, or shared among several hungry children with nothing left for you. Dressing was utilitarian, not expressive. Most lower-class citizens wore rough hemp or cotton robes, tied with simple belts. Footwear was optional for many, but those who had sandals, known as waraji, often found them fraying or worn out from daily use. And in rainy seasons, everything was damp, from your sleeves to your soles. Comfort was not a priority. Function was. Once outside, the real work began. If you were a farmer, your day was consumed by the land, clearing weeds, planting seeds, tending irrigation channels. There were no tractors, no chemical fertilizers, no machines to carry the load. Your tools were simple and often handmade, and your labor was physical, backbreaking, and constant. Even for women, the workload was unrelenting. They were expected to clean, cook, care for children, and often work alongside their husbands in the fields, all while observing the layered customs of etiquette that governed even the most mundane interactions. And if you think you could complain, don't. Grumbling about your lot in life wasn't just frowned upon. It could be dangerous. In many areas, landlords or village elders held near total authority over the community, acting on behalf of the local samurai or daimyo. Disobedience, disrespect, or even the suspicion of laziness could result in harsh punishments, public humiliation, labor fines, or even physical abuse. But maybe you weren't a farmer. Perhaps you were a craftsman in a city like Kyoto or Edo. That might sound more refined, until you realize your workspace was a small, windowless stall crammed between dozens of other noisy shops. You might have spent all morning carving wooden combs, weaving straw mats, or pounding metal to make tools or nails. The smell of hot iron, the flicker of oil lamps, and the constant murmur of street vendors filled your senses while your hands blistered and your eyes strained. You might think, at least there's some freedom in a trade. But even artisans were locked into a strict hierarchy. Guilds controlled your output, local officials controlled your pricing, and customers could be scarce unless your reputation had been built over generations. There were no social safety nets, no pensions, no workers' rights. If you got injured or sick, you were likely done. Your family would suffer, and no one would come to help. And if you happened to be born a woman in this society, your burdens were doubled. Your day might begin before the others, preparing food or washing clothes before the rest of the household even stirred. Daughters learned from a young age to be silent, obedient, and skilled in domestic tasks. There were no schools for most girls, no dreams of careers, no opportunity to read the poetry or philosophy reserved for men. Marriage wasn't a romantic choice. It was a transaction, a responsibility, a social expectation. Now imagine if you were from the lowest class, an outcast, or etiquette. These were people assigned to professions considered unclean, such as tanning leather, handling the dead, or cleaning waste. Their lives were ruled by stigma and shame. Even other peasants avoided them. You could not enter certain shrines, you could not marry freely, and you were excluded from many public functions. Even in a society where most people struggled, you were considered lower than low. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, so did the risks. Disease was common. Clean water was rare. Dental care didn't exist. Minor infections could become deadly. Your diet was often deficient, your body undernourished, and your muscles sore from repetitive labor. There were no breaks, no weekends, and no escape, except for a few stolen moments under a shaded tree, or a chance to share stories with neighbors over a sparse midday meal. The heat in summer was punishing. The cold in winter could leave your fingers numb. Your thatched roof might leak, your walls might let in smoke from the fire pit, and the wind might rattle your wooden shutters all through the night. You didn't own land. At best, you borrowed it in exchange for a percentage of your crop. And if your field didn't yield enough, the taxman still came, often escorted by armed samurai who took what they were owed. In a single day, your tasks ranged from feeding animals and collecting firewood to bowing before elders, submitting reports, mending fences, and preparing fermented pickles for storage. You might deal with a sick child, a broken tool, or an elder who needed care. And you did it all without complaint, without rest, and without question, because that was the only way to survive. Now zoom out for a moment. Imagine being dropped into this world, even with modern knowledge. Would you know how to farm without machines? Could you carry 30 pounds of wet rice stalks through the mud? Would you know how to barter for fish in a market without speaking the right dialect or knowing the local customs? Could you tie your own sandals? Cook with ash and charcoal? Bow the proper way when a samurai passed by. Because in feudal Japan, ignorance wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. By the end of your first day, your hands would be blistered, your back would ache, and your pride would be reduced to silence. The poetic beauty of temples and cherry blossoms would fade into the hard truth of hunger, hierarchy, and unrelenting labor. This was the morning. Just the beginning. And we haven't even made it to nightfall. The most romanticized image of feudal Japan is undoubtedly the figure of the samurai, stoic, noble, cloaked in armor, and wielding a razor-sharp katana with perfect discipline. Modern media often paints them as heroic warriors or protectors of the weak, but the reality was far more complicated, especially if you were a commoner. If you were to last even a single day in this world, you'd have to learn the unspoken rules of survival around the samurai class, and fast. You see, feudal Japan wasn't just a place of daily labor and poverty. It was a place of strict social hierarchies, and at the top, just beneath the emperor and the shogun, stood the samurai. Unlike the image of medieval knights in Europe who lived in castles and followed a chivalric code, samurai weren't simply warriors. They were enforcers, bureaucrats, tax collectors, and sometimes ruthless local rulers. And their code, Bushido, while filled with ideals like honor and loyalty, often left little room for mercy if they felt disrespected. To survive among them, you would have to navigate every movement with precision. Bow too shallowly, and you might be accused of insolence. Bow too deeply and for too long, and you could be seen as mocking or weak. Speak too quickly and you'd be called arrogant. Speak too softly, and you'd be told you had something to hide. The wrong look, the wrong word, or the wrong posture could, quite literally, cost you your life. And no, that's not an exaggeration. Samurai were allowed, by law, to kill a commoner who insulted them or disrespected their status. The act was known as kurasid gomen, the right to strike down. There was no trial. No warning. If a samurai felt you disrespected him or failed to show proper deference, he could draw his sword and cut you down right there in the street, in front of your family, with no consequences. Just imagine walking to the market and brushing shoulders with the wrong man by accident. Or forgetting to dismount your cart as he passed. Or saying something slightly too casual in the presence of a noble's guard. That was all it could take. The sword wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of authority, and no one outside the samurai class was permitted to carry one. This meant that not only were they armed when others were not, but they also carried the weight of the law with them. Their word was more trusted than yours. Their judgment could not be questioned. And you, especially as a commoner, woman, merchant, or craftsman, had no recourse. Now imagine trying to do business under these conditions. Perhaps you were a vendor selling cloth or food in a market. If a samurai came to your stall, you'd be expected to serve him first, even if others had been waiting. You'd be expected to offer a discount, or even give him something for free as a gesture of respect. To protest could be seen as greed or defiance. If he changed his mind and left without paying, you were to bow and thank him for his presence anyway. Even within your home, fear of the samurai loomed. Many served as local enforcers or tax officials, and they could arrive at any time to collect rice, goods, or information on behalf of their daimyo or lord. If your numbers didn't add up or if your story seemed inconsistent, you might be punished, fined, or worse. It didn't matter if a flood ruined your crop or a fire took your tools, taxes were still due. And it was the samurai who ensured they were collected. Now perhaps you're thinking, I'd just be extra careful. I'd learn the rules. I'd stay out of their way. But the rules were not written down for everyone to follow. They were enforced through custom, tradition, and nuance. Many of them changed depending on region, circumstance, or the mood of the individual samurai. Some were just and fair. Others were volatile or brutal. You never knew which one was standing before you. And then there were the rituals. Oh, the rituals. The samurai class lived by a code that valued ceremony and reputation above all else. If you were invited into the home of a minor noble, there were protocols for how to enter, where to sit, how to fold your legs, and when to speak. Missteps could be interpreted as an insult. Even gestures of gratitude, like offering a gift, had layers of significance. Was it too generous? You might be accused of bribery. Too modest? You might be seen as insincere. And if you were to accidentally step on the threshold of a tatama mat reserved for someone of higher rank, you'd better hope they were in a forgiving mood. But perhaps the most harrowing part of the samurai presence was how invisible their grip could feel until it was suddenly crushing. Children grew up fearing them. Women whispered warnings about them. Men deferred to them with unquestioning obedience. And if a samurai fell from favor or lost his master, becoming a ronin, he might become even more dangerous, untethered by duty and desperate for coin or respect. It wasn't only the sword you feared. It was the silence before it. The pause in conversation. The stillness in their expression. A single misinterpreted glance could be fatal. For women, especially, the samurai class brought a unique set of fears. While many samurai households were built on rigid discipline and Confucian ideals of harmony, women were still subject to their husbands' or father's authority in full. A samurai wife was expected to uphold the family's honor, raise the children, manage the household, and at times defend the estate with a dagger if her husband was away. There were brave and educated women among the samurai elite, some even trained in martial arts, but they were still largely bound to lives of submission and sacrifice. If you were a servant in a samurai household, your days were governed by expectations you had no voice in shaping. You bowed when entering rooms. You folded garments in precise ways. You prepared meals in strict order. Even your footsteps were expected to be silent, your breathing minimal. Your mistakes might cost you your livelihood, or worse, your family's reputation. To add to the pressure, there was also the constant political tension among samurai themselves. Clans fought for territory. Alliances were forged and broken. One daimyo might fall out of favor, and his samurai along with him. The balance of power was always shifting. And as a person beneath that layer of society, you were never safe from the aftershocks. One day you might serve a noble family, and the next you could be turned out into the streets after their estate was seized by a rival lord. Now remember, you've only been here for half a day. You've woken in the cold. You've labored in the fields or the shops. You've bowed, deferred, and offered your meager goods to people who might kill you for a misstep. You've watched your words, your gestures, even the height of your gaze. You've felt the invisible pressure of a system built on reverence and fear. And through it all, you've had to pretend that this is normal. That this is simply life. The weight of hierarchy in feudal Japan was not just a matter of class, it was a matter of survival. The samurai were not evil, nor were they always cruel. But they existed in a world where honor was worth more than human life, and where the edge of a blade could end a disagreement faster than words. As the afternoon sun begins to dip low, casting long shadows across stone paths and rice terraces, you might finally have a moment to sit. But your shoulders remain tense. Your eyes dart at each passing figure. And your heart, though tired, cannot yet rest. Because in feudal Japan, rest was a luxury, not a right. And with the samurai always watching, sometimes even from behind paper screens, you learned quickly that safety was an illusion. If you ever find yourself daydreaming about escaping the pressures of modern life, leaving behind deadlines, traffic, bills, and noise, it might be tempting to romanticize the idea of living a simpler life in the past. You might picture open fields, fresh air, a tighter-knit community, and days ruled by the sun instead of screens. But the truth is, for the average person in feudal Japan, life was anything but simple. And for peasants in particular, it was a grueling, exhausting cycle of labor, taxation, and fear. Peasants, hyakusho, as they were known, made up the overwhelming majority of the population in feudal Japan. These were the farmers, the tillers of the land, the people who fed the entire social system. Without their work, there would be no rice to tax, no food for the towns, and no wealth for the ruling class to collect. But despite their crucial role in society, peasants held almost no power. They were, quite literally, the backbone of the country, kept bent and bowed by the weight of those above them. Let's imagine waking up as a peasant in a small rural village. Your home is modest, perhaps built with a wooden frame, thatched roof, and sliding paper walls. It has one main room for sleeping, eating, and sheltering from storms. There is no privacy, no insulation, and no sense of security beyond what your own hands can maintain. Every squeak of the floorboards reminds you that the home is fragile, as is your position in society. The moment you rise from your thin bedding, you're already behind. There are animals to feed, tools to repair, and a day's worth of field work ahead. Your diet is basic: rice, barley, miso soup, and pickled vegetables if you're lucky. Protein is a rare luxury. Meat is often forbidden or reserved for wealthier classes. You eat not for enjoyment but for survival. And yet, even this modest breakfast could feel extravagant if your taxes were recently collected or your last crop was poor. Taxes. That word would follow you everywhere in feudal Japan. Unlike modern taxation, which might involve percentages and deductions, the tax system for peasants was direct and often unforgiving. The daimyo, the feudal lords, collected taxes primarily in the form of rice, the staple crop and the very symbol of wealth. You didn't get to keep all the rice you grew. In fact, you might have to hand over up to 50% or more of your harvest, even if your own family didn't have enough left to eat. Collectors would come at the end of each season, often accompanied by local samurai or officials. They'd measure your yield, evaluate your land, and determine how much you owed. There was little room for negotiation. If the harvest had failed due to drought, flood, or pestilence, it didn't matter. The tax had to be paid. If you couldn't pay in rice, you might owe it in labor, materials, or livestock. And if you resisted or came up short, your family might be punished, your tools confiscated, or your land taken from you. And it wasn't just your own taxes you had to worry about. Villages were often taxed collectively, meaning if one family failed to meet its quota, the others might be expected to make up the difference. This fostered a climate of mutual surveillance, pressure, and occasional resentment. Everyone knew each other's business. Privacy didn't exist. If your neighbor lost a child, everyone knew. If your cart broke, everyone saw. And if your yield was too low, your failure could become everyone's burden. But despite all this, the expectations continued. Farming in feudal Japan was labor-intensive and required careful timing. Rice, the most prized crop, needed to be planted in flooded paddies and required constant tending. You rose before dawn to carry water, weed the fields by hand, chase away pests, and guard against theft or damage. There were no modern pesticides, irrigation systems, or tractors. Everything depended on your body, and sometimes your neighbors. And if you think the off-season brought relief, think again. In winter, you still had to mend tools, prepare seed stock, chop firewood, and weave straw for ropes, sandals, or thatching. You also had village duties, maintaining roads, clearing snow, participating in community rituals, or aiding in local construction projects. The local magistrate might summon you for repair work on a temple or to help fortify the area against bandits or flooding. There was no such thing as a day off. The rhythm of nature and the demands of society dictated your schedule. Illness, injury, or exhaustion were no excuse. You worked through pain. You endured fatigue. And you did it all with little hope of ever moving beyond your station in life. Your family played a role in all of this. Children were not sheltered or spoiled. They were expected to contribute as soon as they could walk. A child might help plant rice seedlings, gather firewood, or tend to younger siblings. Education was minimal or non-existent for most rural children. Instead, they learned by watching how to carry water without spilling, how to bow properly before a passing official, how to speak humbly, and how to stay out of trouble. Marriage was not about love. It was a practical arrangement, often negotiated between families to ensure survival. A daughter might be promised to a man in another village to secure access to more land or labor. A son might be required to take on his father's burdens the moment he could swing a hoe. Widows rarely had the luxury of mourning. They remarried quickly or fell into hardship. And through it all, the weather was your most unpredictable master. A late frost could ruin your crop. A typhoon could destroy your home. A dry season could make your irrigation channels useless. Yet, even then, the tax remained due. You could pray at the local shrine. You could offer incense. But you could not delay your responsibilities. Religion in the village was intertwined with daily life, but it didn't bring personal salvation in the way many modern systems promise. You might worship at a Shinto shrine or visit a Buddhist temple. You made offerings to the spirits, sought protection from local deities, and participated in seasonal festivals. But these were more about communal harmony and ancestral respect than personal belief. There was comfort in ritual, yes, but not escape. And so, your days bled together. Morning blended into evening. Seasons passed. Children grew. Elders passed. You measured time not by events but by harvests. You knew when the plum blossoms arrived and when the cicadas would sing. You tracked the cycles of the moon, the tides of the river, and the sounds of birds to mark the passage of time. Occasionally, something would disrupt the monotony. A traveling official. A fire in the next village. Rumors of a distant rebellion. But for the most part, life remained the same. Quiet. Relentless. Rooted. Could you last in this world? Could you bend your back under the summer sun, knee-deep in water, pulling weeds hour after hour with no break, no shade, and no guarantee your labor would be enough? Could you survive a winter with no central heating, no medical care, and no assurance of food come spring? Could you live in a world where a single drought or tax hike could mean starvation, not just for you, but for your entire family? This was the life of a peasant in feudal Japan. It was not glamorous. It was not peaceful. It was not quiet in the restful sense, but in the resigned, stoic, enduring sense. A silence born not of serenity, but of necessity. So next time you gaze at a photo of an old Japanese village, with its curving roofs and tidy gardens, remember what it took to keep it all standing. The cracked hands, the sore backs, the unspoken sacrifices. And be grateful that your hardest day doesn't begin at dawn, in the mud, with a blade at your back and the weight of a nation's appetite on your shoulders. If you were born a woman in feudal Japan, your life was predetermined before you even took your first breath. From the cradle to the grave, your existence was shaped not by personal dreams or individual ambition, but by duty, tradition, and the will of the men around you. In a world governed by rigid hierarchies and honor-based social codes, being a woman meant navigating a constant tightrope of expectations, obedience, and quiet resilience. You were never the hero of the story. But without you, the story could not be told. To understand the life of a woman in this era, it's important to remember that feudal Japan was a patriarchal society. Men held most positions of power, in politics, the military, and family lineage. Women were considered morally and intellectually inferior by societal standards, a view heavily reinforced by imported Confucian principles that emphasized loyalty, filial piety, and the subservient role of women. These teachings, combined with Buddhist beliefs about female impurity, created an environment where even a woman's silence was sometimes considered too loud. Your day would begin before the rest of the household stirred. Whether you were the daughter of a peasant, the wife of a merchant, or the servant of a samurai family, you were expected to rise early and begin preparing food, drawing water, and completing chores that would often stretch into the night. The labor was physical, repetitive, and largely invisible. No one would thank you. No one would document your contributions. But if you faltered, it would be noticed immediately. In peasant households, women worked beside their husbands in the fields, planting and harvesting rice, maintaining the home, and raising children, all while enduring the same long hours and brutal conditions. In merchant families, they kept the household accounts, managed the inventory, served customers in family-run shops, and were often left to handle business matters when their husbands were away. In samurai homes, women were trained in etiquette, needlework, and household management, expected to represent the dignity of their family through composure, silence, and graceful submission. But do not mistake grace for luxury. Even in more privileged homes, women were under strict surveillance, expected to walk a narrow line between respectability and invisibility. They moved in designated spaces, spoke in subdued tones, and wore layers of symbolic clothing that reflected their status, their age, and their relationship to the men in their family. A woman's hairstyle, sleeve length, and obi knot could say more about her than her words ever would. And then there was marriage. For most women, it wasn't a choice, it was a duty. Marriages were arranged to serve political alliances, social mobility, or economic convenience. Love rarely entered the equation. A woman might be promised to a man she had never met, often at a young age. Once married, she would leave her family and become part of her husband's household, where she was expected to care for his parents, manage his property, and bear his children, especially sons, to carry on the family name. If she failed to produce an heir, her position became precarious. A husband could take a concubine, or in some cases, send her back to her parents in disgrace. And unlike men, women had very little recourse in such matters. Divorce was rare, and women had little legal protection or social support if a marriage ended. Childbirth, too, was dangerous and often solitary. Medical care was minimal, and superstitions about women's bodies added additional layers of fear and restriction. Many women died during labor, their names remembered only in the family registry or whispered in temple prayers. Those who survived went straight back to work, carrying infants on their backs while tending fields or kneading dough or sewing kimonos. Education was another realm where women were restricted. In most cases, formal schooling was reserved for boys, particularly those from the samurai or upper merchant classes. A girl might learn to read or write if her family was progressive or wealthy, but more often, her education focused on obedience, modesty, and domestic skills. She was taught to bow, to pour tea, to speak in soft tones, and to never interrupt. She learned which herbs to use in the kitchen, how to fold a kimono properly, how to kneel in the presence of guests, and how to navigate the quiet politics of a multi-generational household. But for all the rules and restrictions, women in feudal Japan were not without strength. In fact, their resilience was woven into the very fabric of daily life. They ran households with clockwork precision, balanced family books, managed emotional disputes, and passed down cultural traditions through lullabies, stories, and seasonal festivals. In many ways, they held society together. Some even defied the norms. Historical records mention Anabi-geisha, female warriors from noble families who trained in the use of weapons like the naginata and fought to defend their homes during times of war. These women, though exceptional, remind us that femininity in feudal Japan was not synonymous with fragility. It was simply buried under layers of expectation. Others became poets, artists, and writers, often sharing their work anonymously or under male pseudonyms. Their voices, while hushed, still echoed through the corridors of time, revealing inner lives filled with longing, sorrow, joy, and quiet resistance. Religion, too, offered a small window of agency. In Buddhist convents and Shinto shrines, some women found a life outside the constraints of marriage and family. As nuns or shrine maidens, they could engage in spiritual practice, meditation, and even leadership within their communities. But this path was not open to all and required both personal loss and social withdrawal. And yet, through all of this, women were expected to show gratitude, patience, and humility. Their suffering was not considered exceptional. It was simply what was expected. If they complained, they were scolded. If they spoke up, they were silenced. If they tried to change their circumstances, they were met with shame or exile. Now imagine yourself in this world. Could you bear the weight of unspoken expectation every hour of every day? Could you serve without thanks, labor without rest, and carry generations of responsibility with no room to speak your truth? Could you raise children in silence, obey a husband you barely knew, care for in-laws who judged your every move, and smile through grief that had no name? Even if you were strong, intelligent, and capable, would you have any opportunity to show it? And if you did, would you be punished for it? This was the invisible cage of womanhood in feudal Japan. It had no bars, but it confined. It had no lock, but it restrained. It was enforced not by chains, but by customs, rituals, and glances from behind paper doors. And the truth is, most people wouldn't last a day, not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked practice. The women of this world were trained from birth to endure, to adapt, to remain composed in the face of sorrow, and to find purpose in even the smallest acts of service. They lit the lanterns at dusk. They folded the bedding at dawn. They whispered lullabies that never made it into the history books. And they did it all while the world bowed to the men who never truly saw them. So tonight, as you settle into your soft pillow and adjust your blanket, take a moment to reflect. Behind the samurai legends and the noble tales of battle and honor was a quieter story, one of everyday heroism, lived by women who endured, served, and loved in silence. And though history often forgot their names, their lives were anything but small. When imagining life in feudal Japan, it's easy to picture picturesque villages surrounded by rice paddies, delicate meals served in lacquered bowls, and the graceful ritual of tea ceremonies. But for the majority of people, the daily experience of food and cleanliness was far less poetic. The struggle wasn't about choosing what to eat, it was about whether there would be enough to eat. And when it came to hygiene, surviving without falling ill was often a matter of luck as much as habit. Simply put, you wouldn't last long in feudal Japan unless you could endure hunger, filth, and the discomfort of a life lived close to the earth. Let's begin with food. The staple of nearly every meal was rice, but not everyone had equal access to it. Rice was not only food, it was currency, tax, status, and power. For farmers, the irony was harsh. They grew the rice, yet were often too poor to eat it regularly. A significant portion of the harvest went directly to their daimyo as tax. What remained might feed the family for part of the year, if carefully rationed. When rice ran low, people turned to other grains like barley, millet, and buckwheat. These were filling but rougher on the stomach and far less prestigious than the polished white rice eaten by the upper classes. Breakfast was modest. A small bowl of rice or porridge, maybe miso soup if the household had prepared it the night before. Pickled vegetables added flavor, and in coastal areas, small dried fish might appear on the side. But protein was scarce, especially inland. Meat was largely avoided for religious and cultural reasons, and when it was eaten, it usually came from birds or wild game. Fish was the primary source of protein, and even that was dried or salted to make it last longer. Fresh fish was a luxury, and a fleeting one at that. Lunch might be little more than a continuation of breakfast, another bowl of grain, perhaps with a few boiled greens or fermented soybeans. Dinner, if there was one, was similarly sparse. There was little variety, and the concept of a full-course meal was reserved for festivals, temples, or the elite. The diet was largely vegetarian by necessity, not choice. Spices were rare, sugar was expensive, and oil was a luxury. Meals were about sustenance, not satisfaction. For the samurai and noble classes, food carried symbolic meaning. Meals were structured according to seasonal availability, aesthetic presentation, and social ritual. But even these households faced limitations, especially during wartime or times of famine. Droughts, floods, crop failures, and natural disasters could cause widespread hunger, and the burden always fell heaviest on the poorest. Now consider what happened during a bad year. If the rice yield failed, peasants might be forced to eat grass, tree bark, or even clay mixed with grains. Entire families would survive on millet gruel or bitter acorns. Malnutrition weakened the body. Illness followed. And famine was not an abstract fear, it was a recurring reality. Some historical records describe desperate acts: children abandoned to reduce mouths to feed, soup made from straw or mud, and hunger so severe that villagers could no longer work their fields. Even when food was available, it required labor to prepare. Firewood had to be collected. Water had to be drawn from wells or rivers. Pots were heavy and slow to heat. Most homes had a simple hearth, irori, in the center of the floor, doubling as a cooking fire and heat source. There was no running water, no refrigeration, and no sealed containers. Leftovers spoiled quickly. Preservation methods like drying, pickling, and fermenting were essential, and people developed complex techniques to stretch their food supply through lean seasons. But food was only part of the daily struggle. Cleanliness, or the lack of it, posed a constant threat. The idea of hygiene existed, but it was shaped by different values and limited by available resources. In cities and villages, bathhouses were common, and bathing was an important cultural ritual. But for peasants, bathing was often a luxury of time, not just water. Rivers and streams provided opportunities to wash, but in cold weather or during planting season, there was simply no time or energy to do so daily. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist. People used ash, rice bran, or sand to scrub their bodies. Hot water required firewood, which meant more labor. Families often bathed together, reusing the same water in order of social hierarchy: elders first, children last. And while the act of bathing was considered virtuous, it was also sporadic for many. Dirt, sweat, and grime were inescapable, especially for those working in the fields. Clothing was another challenge. Most people owned only one or two sets of garments, typically made from hemp or cotton. Washing clothes was difficult, especially in winter. You wore your clothes until they were too dirty to continue, then soaked them in river water, beat them on rocks, and hung them to dry in the sun. Fabric was precious and repairs were constant. A tear might be patched 5 or 6 times before the garment was finally turned into rags. Toilets were rudimentary. In rural areas, people relieved themselves in the fields or used simple outhouses. Waste was often collected and used as fertilizer, a practice that was both practical and dangerous. Without modern sanitation, the spread of disease was common. Parasites, infections, and foodborne illness plagued both poor and wealthy communities alike. There were no antibiotics, no sterile tools, and very little understanding of germs. A single wound could become fatal. A small stomach illness could take down an entire family. Women faced additional challenges. Menstrual hygiene was handled with rags or paper, cleaned and reused in secret. There was shame and superstition around the process. Pregnant women lacked medical care and gave birth at home, often without a trained midwife. Postpartum infections, miscarriages, and infant mortality were heartbreakingly common. There were no doctors in most villages. Herbalists and healers did what they could, but their knowledge was passed down orally and based more on tradition than science. Illness itself was often treated with prayer. Temples and shrines were visited in hopes of divine intervention. Monks and priests offered blessings, talismans, and chants. While some temples provided herbal remedies, others simply offered comfort through ritual. For the majority, healing meant resting, hoping, and enduring. Urban areas came with their own problems. In cities like Edo or Kyoto, the streets were crowded, and waste disposal was haphazard. Fires were frequent. Vermin were everywhere. Water was shared from communal wells, which meant contamination was easy and outbreaks of disease hard to control. The air was filled with smoke from cooking fires, soot from charcoal, and the odor of unwashed bodies. Despite all this, there was a cultural appreciation for cleanliness. The concept of kegar, spiritual impurity, meant that dirt wasn't just physical, but also moral. Cleansing rituals were part of Shinto tradition, and festivals often involved purification rites. Temples were built near water for a reason, but ideals and reality rarely aligned. You could believe in purity while living in filth. You could revere nature while drinking water from a stream shared with animals. So ask yourself, could you eat the same bland meal day after day, with no spice, no sugar, no variety? Could you go weeks without a real bath, wear the same clothes until they stiffened with sweat and soil, and sleep in a room where smoke clung to every surface? Could you prepare meals over a fire that never quite stayed hot, and draw your water from a well that might dry up or overflow depending on the season? Could you do it while exhausted, sore, cold, and hungry? Could you do it knowing that the next illness might be your last? This was not a life of culinary curiosity or minimalist beauty. It was a daily battle to stay alive, stay fed, and stay just clean enough to keep going. Yet despite these hardships, people adapted. They built rhythms around what was available. Meals became acts of gratitude. Bathing, when it happened, was a moment of peace. Festivals offered relief. Seasons brought change. And even in the hardest times, families gathered, elders shared stories, and children laughed at simple things. But if you, with your heated showers, soft towels, stocked pantry, and temperature-controlled rooms, were dropped into this world, how long would you last? Probably not a day. To be born a child in feudal Japan was not to experience a prolonged period of innocence or play. Childhood was not a protected time, nor was it defined by school days, cartoons, or weekend hobbies. Instead, it was a brief and fragile transition, an often overlooked stretch of life in which a young person was quickly molded into whatever their family, social status, and region demanded. Childhood, in most cases, ended not with age but with usefulness. And for many, it ended almost as soon as it began. From the moment a child was born, their fate was largely determined by the class into which they arrived. A baby born to a noble samurai family would be treated very differently than one born to a farming couple deep in the mountains, a merchant family in a bustling town, or a household at the bottom of society's strict ladder. Social mobility was nearly non-existent. If your father was a blacksmith, you would be expected to become one. If your mother worked the rice paddies, your hands would eventually be calloused by the same labor. Ambition, though possible, was rarely practical. For many children, life began in a small, dark wooden home, warmed by a hearth and wrapped in the quiet routines of a working-class family. Mothers delivered babies at home, often with the assistance of elder women or neighbors. There were no modern tools, no sterile environments, and no safe medications. Survival through childbirth was never guaranteed for either the mother or the baby, and infant mortality was common enough that it shaped many traditions around birth and mourning. When a child was born healthy, families were thankful, but cautious. Until the child grew strong enough to walk, speak, and participate in daily life, they remained vulnerable. If you were born male, expectations settled on you early. You would carry the family name, inherit the house or trade, protect your parents in old age, and serve your local lord through labor or, in the case of samurai families, military service. If you were born female, your role was equally clear: learn to be obedient, graceful, skilled in domestic tasks, and ready for marriage at a suitable age, often by your early teens. The entire structure of your upbringing was a slow march toward these outcomes, shaped by centuries of custom. Toys existed, but not in the way we think of them today. A child might play with handmade dolls, carved wooden animals, or spinning tops. In rural areas, children crafted their own playthings from straw, leaves, or scraps of cloth. These moments of play were brief and often squeezed in between chores. For most, play was not a right, it was a momentary privilege, granted when work was complete, or when elders allowed it. Laughter was not forbidden, but it was quieted by the constant presence of duty. Discipline was swift and expected. Children were taught to bow, to speak humbly, to use proper language when addressing elders or superiors. Any sign of disrespect, laziness, or clumsiness could be met with sharp correction. In samurai households, children were often raised with the same strict codes of behavior expected of adults. Boys might begin martial training by the age of 5 or 6, learning how to sit properly, hold a wooden sword, recite poetry, and memorize the family's honor code. Girls were taught etiquette, embroidery, tea service, and the skills needed to run a household with dignity. Schooling was not universal. In rural areas, many children never learned to read or write. Their education came from watching their parents, helping with the fields, and learning by doing. They learned how to plant and harvest rice, how to tend to animals, how to patch clothing, and how to survive on very little. Their memories were filled not with lessons from a chalkboard but with the weight of baskets, the sting of cold river water, and the smell of soil. In towns and cities, things were slightly different. Some merchant families, eager to pass on bookkeeping skills or manage a growing business, would hire tutors or send their sons to temple schools. These schools taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, often using Buddhist or Confucian texts. Lessons were repetitive and focused on discipline. Boys sat in rows on straw mats, copying characters onto paper with ink and brush. They were scolded for sloppiness, praised for silence. There were no colorful posters, no play-based learning. Education was a serious matter, and one that rarely extended to girls unless their family was particularly progressive or wealthy. Apprenticeship was the more common form of learning for most children. By the age of 7 or 8, a child might be sent to work alongside a master craftsman, monk, merchant, or distant relative. This was especially true for second sons, who had fewer rights to family inheritance. As apprentices, they learned by sweeping floors, carrying water, fetching tools, and watching silently. They earned their keep by being useful. Days were long, supervision was strict, and failure was not tolerated. It was considered an honor to serve and learn, no matter how menial the task. If a child misbehaved or failed to meet expectations, consequences varied. Physical punishment was common in many households, considered a necessary part of moral development. Children were taught that suffering built character, that pain taught respect, and that endurance was a virtue. Public shaming, scolding, or isolation might also be used. But unlike today, where discipline often involves lectures or grounding, children in feudal Japan had little time to reflect. The next task always awaited. and then there was war. During times of conflict, which were frequent throughout the feudal period, children could be displaced, orphaned, or drafted into service roles. In samurai families, young boys were trained in martial arts, strategy, and loyalty from a young age, preparing them to become warriors. They practiced with wooden swords, memorized battle tactics, and were told stories of valor and self-sacrifice. They were taught to face death with dignity, and to place honor above life. Some were sent to live with other samurai families to learn discipline and independence. Girls in noble families were also trained, though not for war. They were taught music, calligraphy, etiquette, and the management of servants. In times of siege, they might be expected to help defend the household with daggers or poison, or to commit ritual suicide if captured. The stakes of growing up were high. Even for the elite, life was fragile and full of pressure. Illness was another constant threat. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no access to modern sanitation. Children caught fevers, coughed through the night, and often died young. Common causes of death included measles, smallpox, diarrhea, respiratory infections, and malnutrition. Some communities believed in charms, talismans, or prayers to ward off illness. Others accepted that child death was simply part of life. Families grieved, but quickly returned to their routines. For children of outcast families, those labeled as ETA or HYGIENE, life was even harsher. These children were shunned, excluded from schools and religious ceremonies, and forced to live on the fringes of society. They were denied rights, ridiculed, and used for the most unpleasant forms of labor. Even children bore the burden of social discrimination, with few avenues for escape. Despite all this, childhood was not entirely without light. In every village, there were moments of joy, festivals where children could dance, eat sweets, or watch puppet shows, seasonal games played with kites, paper balls, or tops, and stories passed down from grandparents under the soft glow of a single lantern. These small joys stitched together a sense of continuity and culture. They reminded children that they were part of something larger than themselves, a family, a village, a world. But joy was never separate from responsibility. Even a game could be interrupted by a chore. Even a story could be cut short by a cry from the field. And so, children learned early how to work, when to be quiet, and what was expected of them. They grew up not in years, but in tasks. So could you survive this childhood? Could you fetch water from the river every morning, sweep the dirt floor, harvest vegetables, and prepare meals, all before noon? Could you endure cold nights in a paper-walled home, eat the same bland porridge for weeks, and wake up knowing your worth was tied entirely to your usefulness? Could you bow properly, speak only when spoken to, and accept that your dreams, if you had any, might never matter? It's hard to imagine, isn't it? Childhood in feudal Japan was not about discovery, it was about duty. And for most children, it was over far too soon. In the modern world, the concept of an 8-hour workday is seen as a reasonable balance, a structured block of time after which rest is expected and deserved. Even in the most demanding professions today, there are typically moments of pause, coffee breaks, scheduled days off, or a quiet hour after dinner. But in feudal Japan, the idea of a limited workday simply didn't exist for the majority of the population. Whether you were a peasant, a craftsman, a merchant, or even a low-ranking samurai, your day was an endless chain of tasks, responsibilities, and expectations, each tied not only to your survival but to your reputation and place in society. To understand the intensity of labor during this period, it helps to set aside the idea of work as separate from life. In feudal Japan, labor was life. From the moment you opened your eyes in the morning, your body was enlisted into motion. You weren't expected to prepare for the day, you were already late to it. The fields needed tending, the animals feeding, the fire relighting, and the rice steaming. For artisans, the tools had to be sharpened, the materials sorted, and the space swept before the sun had fully risen. There was no start bell, no shift change, and no retirement plan. The only endpoint to the daily grind was illness, injury, or death. Peasants, who formed the bulk of the working class, spent their days outdoors in the dirt and weather, engaged in agricultural labor that demanded every ounce of physical energy. Rice farming was particularly intense. Fields had to be flooded, planted by hand with delicate seedlings, weeded under the sun, monitored for pests, and then harvested on schedule. Tools were rudimentary, made of wood and iron, worn down from constant use. Plowing was done with oxen, if your family could afford them, but most often by hand. Irrigation channels had to be dug and maintained, requiring teamwork and constant supervision. A single day's work might include chopping and stacking firewood, hauling buckets of water, repairing fences, threshing grain, mending clothing, and preparing fermented vegetables for storage. None of it could be skipped, and none of it had backup. If you were sick, someone else had to take on your share. If no one could, the work simply didn't get done, and you paid the price later. In coastal villages, fishermen rose before dawn to ready their boats. They sailed into uncertain waters with hand-woven nets and wooden oars, braving storms, swells, and sharp rocks to bring in enough catch to support not just their families, but their communities. Fish spoiled quickly, and if not preserved or sold quickly, their labor could be wasted. Women often waited on the shore, ready to sort, clean, salt, and prepare the fish for drying racks or the evening market. It was not uncommon for a full day's labor to result in just enough earnings to buy more rice for tomorrow's meal. For craftsmen in towns and cities, the labor was no less grueling, though it took on different forms. Blacksmiths, potters, weavers, and carpenters operated in cramped, dimly lit workshops that smelled of sweat, smoke, and iron. Many lived where they worked, sleeping in the same space where they forged blades or threw clay. The tools of the trade were precious and often passed down through generations. Apprentices began their training young, scrubbing floors, heating kilns, sorting fibers, before they were ever allowed to touch the core work. Craftsmanship in feudal Japan was precise and unforgiving. A single flawed edge on a sword, a misshaped bowl, or a crack in a plank could ruin a product and tarnish a craftsman's reputation. There were guilds that monitored quality and set prices, but also imposed rigid standards that left little room for experimentation. If your work didn't meet expectations, you could be fined, demoted, or driven out of business entirely. The concept of wabi-sabi, beauty in imperfection, may have influenced aesthetics, but it didn't excuse failure in utility. Merchants, though wealthier than peasants, had their own burdens. Officially considered lower in the Confucian class structure, below warriors and farmers, they were often looked down upon despite their growing economic power. They worked long hours managing stock, bartering with customers, maintaining ledgers, and transporting goods. The labor might not have been as physical, but it required constant vigilance. Mistakes in measurement, pricing, or etiquette could result in loss of trust and customers. In marketplaces, competition was fierce. Relationships with suppliers had to be carefully managed. A single misstep in the social dance of negotiation could damage your standing and cost you valuable trade. Women labored just as hard, and often longer, especially in lower-class households. Their responsibilities included grinding grain, spinning thread, cleaning, cooking, childcare, sewing, and more. They might also help in the fields or workshops, manage household budgets, or contribute to family businesses. Their work was invisible to outsiders but essential to family survival. Even elderly women, well past their physical prime, were expected to help with weaving, tending to gardens, or watching grandchildren. There was no retirement in the traditional sense. As long as you could move, you worked. And then there were the seasonal expectations. Planting season demanded dawn to dusk days in the fields. Harvest season required every available hand to bring in crops before storms or rot set in. In the winter, time was spent making repairs, preparing storage, and creating goods for sale or trade. In spring, attention shifted to cleaning, planting, and religious ceremonies. The seasons dictated the flow of labor, and no part of the year was truly restful. For samurai, whose public image is often tied to swordplay and poetry, the reality of daily labor was also demanding, though in different ways. Many mid- and low-ranking samurai served administrative roles. They were tax collectors, law enforcers, bureaucrats, and military trainers. Their work required paperwork, reporting, training exercises, and ceremonial duties that had to be performed with absolute precision. A mistake in protocol could mean disgrace. A lapse in judgment could cost them their stipend, or worse, their honor. If a samurai was not actively employed or fell out of favor, he might become a ronin, a masterless warrior with no income or protection. Many of these men turned to teaching, security, or even manual labor to survive. Their status may have once been high, but without backing, they joined the ranks of the struggling. Their daily labor, once ritualized and respected, became desperate and practical. Even among the warrior class, work never truly stopped. Religious workers, too, were engaged in constant labor. Monks maintained temples, copied texts, performed rituals, tended gardens, and provided support to the local community. Shrine maidens performed purification rites, sang prayers, and upheld the spiritual cleanliness of their surroundings. Religious life required discipline, focus, and tireless commitment, not isolation or peace as is often imagined. One of the most grueling aspects of labor in feudal Japan was the lack of relief. Illness did not guarantee rest. Most people worked through fever, injury, and fatigue. If someone could not work, their family suffered. If a parent died, the children worked harder. If an elder fell ill, the youngest members of the household might take over their duties. There were no sick days. There was no paid time off. The body was expected to endure. What few holidays existed were tied to festivals and religious observances. These were joyful but brief. Even on special days, there was still work to be done, food to prepare, spaces to clean, rituals to observe. Even leisure came with duties. The truth is, if you were dropped into feudal Japan for even one day, you would be overwhelmed by the sheer constancy of motion. Your muscles would ache by noon. Your hands would blister. Your stomach would grumble. Your mind would reel from the need to remember every unspoken rule, every task's proper sequence, and every person's status. There would be no clock to punch in or out, no time to relax with a drink, no space to mentally unwind. You would fall asleep out of necessity, not comfort. And you'd wake up knowing that everything you did yesterday would need to be repeated again, and again, and again. Because in feudal Japan, work was not a phase. It was life itself. In the intricate web of feudal Japanese society, every action was governed by rules, some written, many unwritten. These rules extended far beyond criminal law or civic duty. They touched every aspect of daily life: how to speak, how to bow, how to dress, how to show respect, how to serve, and most importantly, how to obey. And while order brought a sense of structure, it also came at a steep cost. Because if you failed to follow these expectations, whether through ignorance, mistake, or defiance, the consequences could be swift, severe, and deeply humiliating. Disobedience in feudal Japan was not always a matter of breaking the law. It could be something as small as speaking too boldly to a superior, wearing the wrong color to a festival, or taking a shortcut through a path reserved for a higher class. While today these actions might be dismissed as social faux pas, in feudal Japan they could mark a person, or an entire family, for punishment or disgrace. At the heart of this system was the concept of honor. Honor was not just personal, it was collective. It extended to one's family, one's ancestors, and one's descendants. Losing your honor didn't just shame you, it cast a shadow on everyone connected to you. This created a society in which people monitored their every move, not only to protect themselves but to uphold the reputation of their house. Shame was a powerful tool, often used as both punishment and deterrent. The formal legal system in feudal Japan was multilayered and often localized. In villages, disputes might be handled by elders or local magistrates. In towns and cities, appointed officials enforced laws passed down by the shogunate or regional daimyo. Penalties varied greatly depending on one's class. A samurai who committed a crime might be allowed to atone through ritual suicide, a grim yet honorable end. A peasant, artisan, or merchant could be fined, whipped, imprisoned, or worse, publicly humiliated. One of the more common punishments was public shaming. Offenders might be paraded through town with signs detailing their offense, forced to wear specific garments indicating their shame, or tied to posts in a central square for others to mock. These punishments were not just meant to correct behavior, they were intended to set an example. The goal was deterrence through degradation. And because a person's honor was their social currency, the loss of it could be socially devastating, sometimes more so than physical pain. Corporal punishment was also used widely. Floggings, beatings, and even mutilation were carried out in public view. Thieves might have a hand cut off. Repeat offenders could be branded. The sound of punishment, cries, scoldings, the crack of bamboo rods, was a regular part of city and village life. These were not hidden practices. They were communal experiences, reminders of the line between order and chaos. Punishments were not limited to criminal acts. A servant in a noble household who spilled tea on their master might be beaten or dismissed without warning. A child who disobeyed could be whipped or locked away. A wife who spoke out of turn might be sent back to her family in disgrace, damaging both her parents and her husband's status. Even a craftsman who failed to meet quality standards could be blacklisted, his tools confiscated, and his name smeared by his guild. The samurai class, while steeped in notions of discipline and honor, were not above these punishments either. If a samurai was found guilty of betrayal, cowardice, or a serious breach of etiquette, he might be ordered to commit seppuku, a ritual suicide believed to restore lost honor. The process was both private and public. The act took place in the presence of witnesses and was considered both punishment and redemption. It was deeply ritualistic, a final, painful proof of one's loyalty to the code of Bushido. While some volunteered for seppuku to avoid capture or shame, others were ordered to do so as a sentence. For commoners, there was no such tragic dignity in death. Executions were performed publicly and could be brutal. Hanging, beheading, or crucifixion, known as heretsuke, were all used at different times and places, often reserved for the most serious crimes or repeat offenses. Heretsuke involved tying the condemned to a wooden cross, where they were displayed for hours or even days before dying of exposure or being executed with a spear. These acts were not only punishments, they were warnings. But physical punishment was only one layer. The deeper damage came from ostracism. If a family or individual was deemed dishonorable, the community might quietly turn against them. No one would sell to them. No one would marry into their family. Invitations to festivals, temple events, or trade gatherings would vanish. Their children would be taunted. Their presence would go unacknowledged. This kind of social exile could last for generations. In a tightly knit society built on relationships and interdependence, isolation was a slow and inescapable form of suffering. Even status violations were punishable. Peasants were forbidden from wearing certain fabrics or colors, riding horses, or carrying weapons. If a low-ranking person was caught impersonating someone of higher status, whether by dress, manner, or occupation, the punishment was swift. The system was not just rigid, it was actively policed by everyone in it. Villagers reported neighbors. Merchants reported customers. Servants whispered about their masters. It was a culture of constant observation, fueled by fear of shared consequences. Religious and cultural violations were also serious. Desecrating a shrine, speaking disrespectfully of one's ancestors, or breaking taboos around cleanliness could lead to community scolding, formal punishment, or even spiritual exorcisms. Superstition played a strong role in enforcing rules, especially in rural areas. A person who violated ritual norms might be blamed for bad harvests, sickness, or misfortune. They might be labeled as cursed, and those around them would avoid contact, fearful that the impurity could spread. One of the most heartbreaking forms of punishment involved the use of collective responsibility. In some villages and city districts, residents were grouped into neighborhood associations called ganingumi, groups of 5 families responsible for one another's behavior. If one member committed a crime or fell behind on taxes, all could be punished. This created a constant pressure to monitor others, to discourage deviance, and to enforce discipline through peer pressure. The result was a system in which even private thoughts could feel dangerous. Imagine living like this. Every word you spoke might be overheard. Every gesture could be misread. A moment of frustration, a lapse in posture, a poorly timed joke, any of it could become a spark. And if it did, your punishment would be swift, public, and humiliating. You wouldn't be able to defend yourself with modern sensibilities. No one would care that your offense was accidental or that your intent was innocent. The rules were ancient, rooted in centuries of ritual and reinforced by generations who had suffered for their mistakes. Even if you managed to follow every rule perfectly, you could still fall victim to the wrath or whim of someone above you. A powerful landlord could accuse you unjustly. A jealous neighbor could whisper lies. A mistake by your child could stain your name. And once your reputation was damaged, it was nearly impossible to restore. Could you survive in such a world? Could you live each day under the weight of expectation, knowing that one misstep might lead to disgrace, physical pain, or even death? Could you live without sarcasm, without protest, without the assumption that fairness would win in the end? Feudal Japan was not a world that tolerated questioning. It was a world that demanded submission. And while many lived within its walls with dignity, strength, and grace, they did so by mastering a delicate, exhausting art, the art of knowing when to speak, when to bow, when to obey, and when to disappear into the crowd. Because in a place where disobedience could cost you everything, even the smallest act of defiance could be your last. Every society has its outcasts, but few systems were as deliberately structured and harshly enforced as the caste divisions of feudal Japan. While the samurai strode proudly through courtyards and nobles debated poetry over porcelain cups, entire groups of people lived in quiet shadows, unseen, unwanted, and deliberately kept at the bottom of a rigid social order. These were the outcasts, the ones the system needed but refused to honor. Their lives were defined not by privilege or ambition but by exclusion, labor, and the constant sting of humiliation. In feudal Japan, the caste system wasn't just an informal hierarchy. It was a deeply entrenched code that shaped everything from where you lived to what you wore, what you touched, and whom you could marry. While the Shirnokeosho system, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, dominated official records and Confucian ideals, a fifth, unspoken category existed beneath them, the Burakumin, often translated as the village people, though the meaning carried a bitter irony. These people were not simply poor. They were ritually unclean by birth, relegated to the dirtiest jobs and the most degrading conditions, with no hope of climbing out. Within this group were specific designations. The etiquette, or much filth, handled tasks deemed impure by Buddhist and Shinto standards: tanning hides, butchering animals, disposing of human and animal waste, preparing corpses for funerals, and cleaning execution grounds. These were essential jobs that society relied on yet refused to acknowledge. Their work was invisible, and when it wasn't, it was reviled. No matter how skilled an etiquette craftsman became at leatherworking or blade forging, he could never rise in status. His birth defined him more than his ability ever could. Then there were the HYGIENE, or non-human, class. This included beggars, street performers, ex-convicts, and others who existed entirely outside the system. Some were born into this status. Others fell into it through misfortune or crime. Once labeled HYGIENE, there was little chance of returning to human society. These individuals often lived in makeshift shelters, near rivers or city outskirts, surviving on scraps and seasonal labor. Some served as entertainers or scavengers. Others were arrested repeatedly simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Living as an outcast in feudal Japan meant more than being poor. It meant being marked. In many cases, outcast communities were segregated into designated villages, often on the outskirts of towns or near waste dumps. Their homes were smaller, their tools older, and their access to temples, schools, and markets severely restricted. They were forbidden to enter certain shrines, touch sacred objects, or participate in communal festivals. Even their shadows, it was said, could pollute the purity of a nobleman's estate. Children born into outcast families inherited this status automatically. They did not attend school. They were not permitted to marry outside their caste. If they tried to leave their community, they were quickly identified, by their dialect, their appearance, or the trades they had learned. Outsiders watched them with suspicion, and violence against them was often ignored. The system was so deeply rooted that even centuries later, descendants of these communities would still face discrimination. Despite the weight of this oppression, life continued. Outcast villages formed their own customs, built their own institutions, and supported one another as best they could. Some became highly skilled in crafts that others would not touch. Leather armor, drum skins, scroll bindings, and certain kinds of sword hilts were often produced in these villages. The irony was clear. The most prized weapons and instruments of the elite were crafted by hands that were otherwise considered untouchable. Punishments for stepping outside these boundaries were swift. An ETA who refused his assigned labor could be beaten, imprisoned, or executed. A HYGIENE who tried to live among commoners might be chased out of town or turned in by fearful neighbors. Some found work as laborers on major construction projects, building roads, bridges, and fortifications, but even there, their wages were lower and their rights non-existent. Religious institutions were not much kinder. While Buddhism taught compassion and the cycle of rebirth, and Shintoism emphasized ritual purity, both systems contributed to the belief that outcasts were spiritually tainted. They were often denied access to funeral rites, marriage ceremonies, and temple blessings. Death itself did not bring equality. Ada families might be forced to bury their dead outside of city cemeteries, or cremate them without proper rites. Yet, in their isolation, these communities created their own rituals. They honored their ancestors, marked the seasons, and preserved stories that spoke of resilience. Folktales, songs, and oral histories circulated quietly, passing down pride even in the face of systemic rejection. These weren't just people struggling to survive, they were people trying to live with dignity in a world that had stripped them of recognition. The caste system was not enforced uniformly across all of Japan. Some regions were stricter than others. In certain towns, outcast families quietly integrated into commoner life, adopting new surnames or moving between provinces. But these cases were rare, and success often came at great personal cost, cutting ties with family, risking discovery, or living in constant fear of exposure. A slip of the tongue, an old acquaintance, or a record in a village ledger could unmake everything. Even within outcast communities, hierarchies existed. Those who worked in tanneries might be considered cleaner than those who handled the dead. Families with specific skills might be seen as more useful. But in the eyes of the broader world, these distinctions meant little. Outside the walls of their communities, they were all the same, faceless, nameless, necessary, and ignored. Now imagine yourself born into this world. Your name already counts against you. Your village is known, marked on maps with quiet symbols that no one speaks aloud. You grow up knowing you cannot walk freely in your own country. You see children your age walking to school while you help your parents scrape hides or carry waste. You're told not to speak too loudly, not to stare too long, not to expect too much. Every gesture must be humble, every interaction cautious. You fall in love with someone from a different village, only to learn that your love is a crime against social order. You craft something beautiful, but no one will buy it under your name. You hear others speak of duty and honor, while knowing that your existence is seen as a stain upon both. You are punished not for what you've done, but for who you are. Could you survive that? Could you keep working, smiling, caring, and hoping, knowing that the system was never built for you, and never would be? Because in feudal Japan, life on the margins wasn't rare. It was structured, codified, deliberate, and for many, it lasted a lifetime. In today's world, travel often means convenience. You can board a plane and cross oceans in hours, hop on a train, or drive for miles in the comfort of a climate-controlled car. But in feudal Japan, travel was not a privilege, a hobby, or a break from routine. It was a slow, grueling, and often dangerous journey, one made on foot, by river, or atop a pack animal, along narrow roads plagued with risk. Most people lived their entire lives without leaving the village where they were born, and for good reason. In a world built on rigid social order, movement between places meant exposure, vulnerability, and countless opportunities for something to go wrong. The roads that crisscrossed feudal Japan were not highways or cobblestone lanes. They were dirt paths, muddy when wet, dusty when dry, and often barely wide enough for two people to pass each other without brushing shoulders. The best known of these was the Takedo, a major road connecting Edo, modern-day Tokyo, to Kyoto. It was one of 5 official routes established by the Tokugawa shogunate, maintained for the movement of daimyo and government officials. But even this prestigious road was no luxury thoroughfare. It required days, often weeks, of walking, climbing, and enduring the elements. The average person, if granted permission to travel at all, moved on foot. Sandals made of straw or bark would wear out after a few days, requiring constant repairs. The terrain could be punishing: steep mountain passes, slippery river crossings, dense forests, and remote stretches with no shelter for miles. There were few bridges, and rivers had to be forded or crossed by ferry when available. During the rainy season, these rivers swelled, washed out roads, and trapped travelers on either bank for days at a time. If you were traveling by river, your journey would depend on narrow wooden boats, small, fragile crafts pushed along by poles or guided with primitive sails. Strong currents, sudden storms, or hidden rocks could capsize them easily. There were no life jackets. If the boat sank, you were at the mercy of the water and your own ability to swim, if you'd ever learned. Drowning was a common cause of death among travelers, and boatmen carried their own superstitions and rituals to guard against ill fortune on the water. But even if the roads and rivers cooperated, the biggest challenge was often bureaucracy. Travel in feudal Japan was heavily restricted. You couldn't just pack a bag and go. Movement between provinces or even towns required a written permit, known as a tagata, issued by a local authority. These permits declared your purpose, destination, and status. Travelers without one could be stopped at checkpoints and turned back, or arrested. The sekisho, or checkpoints, were stationed along all major roads and operated by armed guards. Their job was to control who entered and left each region, to prevent illegal migration, escapees, or the spread of rebellion. They scrutinized papers, questioned travelers, and sometimes searched belongings. Women in particular were heavily monitored, especially wives or daughters of daimyo, who were sometimes held in cities as political hostages to prevent uprisings. If a woman tried to flee, the guards were trained to catch and return her. Smugglers and forgers who created fake papers were punished severely, often by execution. For the peasant class, permission to travel was rarely granted unless it was tied to specific labor, trade, or religious pilgrimage. Even then, the request had to be justified, approved by local officials, and documented. Most peasants feared the very idea of travel. It took them away from their crops, risked the ire of their landlords, and opened them to suspicion. A farmer gone too long might return to find his land reassigned. A merchant traveling without proper seals might lose his goods. And any traveler without connections was subject to theft, exploitation, or violence on the road. Inns, known as hatago, lined the more established routes, but these were not always hospitable. They varied in quality, cost, and safety. Some were little more than thatched huts offering a mat and a bowl of thin soup. Others were controlled by local bosses who might overcharge or extort travelers, especially those who looked vulnerable. A lone traveler could be robbed or drugged. A sick traveler might be turned away for fear of spreading illness. Hospitality was not guaranteed. It was a transaction, often shaped by politics and prejudice. And then there were the bandits. The isolated stretches of road and forest provided perfect cover for thieves. Travelers carrying goods or coin were obvious targets. Samurai and armed escorts offered some protection, but even they were not immune. Bandits were not just desperate criminals. They were sometimes former soldiers, dismissed retainers, or ronin turned rogue. These men knew the land, understood the patrols, and could vanish into the mountains as quickly as they had appeared. To protect themselves, travelers often moved in groups. Merchant caravans and pilgrim bands offered safety in numbers. But this created other issues: slowing down for the weakest member, rationing food, managing disputes, and staying together in unfamiliar terrain. The larger the group, the more attention it attracted, sometimes from guards, sometimes from criminals. Even official travel was burdensome. Daimyo processions, required by the shogunate to travel to Edo every other year in an expensive system of alternate attendants, Sankin Kotai, involved hundreds of retainers, carts, and horses. These processions clogged roads, consumed local supplies, and exhausted entire domains financially. The spectacle was grand, but the logistics were brutal. Roads had to be cleared, food prepared, and inns reserved. The cost of such travel was a deliberate method of control, keeping powerful lords too drained to rebel. For women, travel came with unique dangers and restrictions. Solo travel was rare and discouraged. Female pilgrims had to move with other women, or under male supervision. Female entertainers, courtesans, and traveling musicians faced stigma and suspicion, often stopped at checkpoints or denied access to certain towns. Their appearance and status made them targets, both of legal scrutiny and unwanted attention. And while some found freedom in the road, escaping arranged marriages or cruel households, many more disappeared into the silence of the countryside, forgotten by the records that never counted them in the first place. Food on the road was another challenge. Travelers had to carry dry goods, rice, pickles, roasted soybeans, or preserved fish. These were wrapped in bamboo leaves or stored in paper packets tied with string. Fresh food was rare unless you could afford to buy it at a roadside stall, if one existed. Water had to be drawn from streams or village wells, often shared with animals or contaminated by waste. A bad drink or spoiled meal could lead to days of suffering, with no access to medicine or care. And let's not forget the weather. Japan's seasons are distinct and often harsh. Summer brought heat and humidity, turning the roads into sweltering dust bowls. Typhoon season flooded rivers and washed out bridges. Winter iced over mountain passes, made roads impassable, and forced travelers to huddle around flickering fires in crowded inns. Spring and autumn offered the most pleasant conditions, but even then, the unpredictability of nature loomed. A storm could trap you for days. A landslide could force a 100-mile detour. Religious pilgrimage offered a rare exception to travel restrictions. Temples like Koyasan or Ishijingu were destinations for the devout, and pilgrims were sometimes granted travel leniency. They carried walking staffs, wore straw hats, and chanted prayers as they moved between sacred sites. But even this piety did not protect them from the hardships of the road. They still needed permits. They still walked in worn sandals. They still faced hunger, illness, and suspicion. And when they returned, if they returned, they carried more than blessings. They carried the weight of what they had endured. Could you manage all of this? Could you walk for miles in heat or rain, sleep on hard mats with strangers, eat cold rice from a cloth bundle, and navigate checkpoints with trembling hands? Could you handle the silence of a forest road, the smell of sweat and smoke in a crowded inn, or the fear that the next bend in the path might bring trouble? Could you do it all without GPS, without a map you could read, without a language you spoke fluently, and without a credit card in your pocket? In feudal Japan, every journey was a gamble, and most people chose not to play. In the towering mountains, the misty forests, and even the narrow wooden corridors of modest homes, the people of feudal Japan lived surrounded by unseen forces. Their lives were shaped not only by lords and landlords, not only by weather and war, but also by spirits, both benevolent and dangerous. Religion in this era was not confined to temples or quiet moments of prayer. It was woven into every detail of life, from the way one bowed in the morning to the objects placed on a kitchen altar. To survive a single day in this world, you would need more than strength, status, or stamina. You would need the right rituals, the right offerings, and the deep, instinctive ability to respect what could not be seen. Religion in feudal Japan was an intricate fusion of Shinto and Buddhism, two belief systems that existed not in competition but in layers. Shinto, the older native religion of Japan, emphasized harmony with nature and reverence for kami, spirits or deities found in everything from rivers and trees to rocks and storms. These kami could be protective or temperamental, and they were believed to dwell in particular places, requiring purification rituals and offerings to keep them content. Shinto did not rely on a holy book or single doctrine. It was a web of practice, folklore, and seasonal observance. Buddhism, imported from China and Korea centuries earlier, added a more structured system of belief in rebirth, karma, and spiritual enlightenment. It offered explanations for suffering, paths for the dead, and philosophies for enduring hardship. Over time, the two systems merged in the daily practices of the people. A family might visit a Shinto shrine to bless a newborn, hold a Buddhist funeral for a grandparent, and place seasonal offerings for both on a shared household altar. There was no contradiction, only the quiet belief that spiritual balance mattered more than strict dogma. For the common people, religion was less about theology and more about ritual obligation. Every village had its shrines, every family its prayers. Before eating, you might whisper thanks to the spirits of the harvest. Before bathing, you might nod toward the small household altar. Before traveling, you might stop by a wayside shrine, ringing a bell and leaving a coin for safe passage. These actions were not dramatic. They were habitual, like breathing. Children learned them before they could speak fluently. Elders performed them with such practiced grace they seemed part of the landscape. But alongside devotion came superstition, a deep and constant awareness of spiritual risk. The line between the natural and supernatural was thin. A sick child might not be viewed simply as ill, but as cursed or haunted. A series of misfortunes might be blamed on an offended ancestor, an ignored shrine, or a careless word spoken near a sacred tree. To you, these may sound like stories, but to those living in feudal Japan, they were warnings. The home itself was a sacred space, and great care was taken not to invite misfortune indoors. Objects like ofuda, protective talismans, were placed above doors. Altars honoring ancestors, called butsudan, were tended daily with incense, rice, and seasonal flowers. Spirits of the dead were believed to linger, not in some far-off realm, but nearby, watching, listening. Neglecting their memory could lead to unrest in the home. A cold wind, a broken tool, a sudden sickness, these were signs. And if signs were ignored, problems worsened. People visited onmyoji, or spiritual specialists, to diagnose these disturbances. An onmyoji might read omens, consult celestial charts, or prescribe purification rituals. In some villages, a miko, a shrine maiden, performed dances and chants to drive away evil spirits. These roles were respected, feared, and sometimes misunderstood. Their power wasn't in spectacle, but in their ability to mediate between the human and the unseen. And then there were yurei, ghosts. These were not the playful or decorative kind found in modern stories. Yurei were restless spirits of the dead, often women who had died with unresolved emotions. They were said to drift between worlds, their hair long, their clothes white, their voices silent. The idea of a ghost seeking revenge, justice, or remembrance was deeply embedded in the culture. Stories of yurei were shared around fire pits, carved into woodblock prints, and whispered on long, lonely walks through misty hills. These beliefs were not limited to the countryside. In bustling cities like Edo and Kyoto, wealthy merchants and samurai households alike performed daily rites. Buddhist monks offered services for the souls of ancestors. Ritual calendars dictated when to visit temples, when to fast, when to burn incense. Urban life might have been busier, but it was no less steeped in spiritual obligation. For a samurai, religious life held particular weight. The Bushido Code stressed not only discipline and loyalty, but also acceptance of death. Zen Buddhism in particular appealed to warriors, emphasizing meditation, mindfulness, and detachment from worldly fear. A samurai might begin his day with quiet reflection, recite sutras before battle, or contemplate impermanence beneath a cherry blossom tree. But even the most disciplined warriors still carried charms, respected shrines, and feared ghosts. Certain events brought heightened religious attention. Births, coming-of-age ceremonies, marriages, and especially funerals were all spiritual transitions. A funeral involved layers of ritual, washing the body, dressing it in white, placing coins for the journey to the afterlife, and holding days of chanting and prayer. The family would mourn in black, refrain from certain foods, and avoid festive activities. They believed the spirit lingered before crossing over. Proper mourning ensured peace for the dead and the living. But not every death received this care. If someone died alone, violently, or without proper rites, their spirit was said to linger. These were the most feared ghosts, angry, confused, or vengeful. Travelers avoided areas known for such deaths. Shrines were erected at crossroads or near cliffs to pacify them. Priests were called to perform sigaki, rituals to feed and release the hungry ghosts. Even natural disasters were interpreted spiritually. Earthquakes, floods, famines, these were not merely environmental events, but signs of imbalance. The kami were angry. The ancestral spirits were neglected. Temples organized prayers for rain, processions for peace, or purification of tainted lands. When a drought ended or the harvest returned, people believed their efforts had succeeded, not just through labor, but through respect for the invisible forces guiding the world. Seasonal festivals provided moments of spiritual renewal. Oban, held in summer, was the time to welcome the spirits of ancestors back home. Lanterns were lit, dances performed, offerings placed before altars. Families cleaned graves, recited prayers, and guided spirits with floating lights on rivers. It was a festival of joy and remembrance, but also a reminder of the thin veil between life and death. And so, every day in feudal Japan was a balance of action and belief. You planted rice, but thanked the field's spirit. You lit a fire, but offered a pinch of salt to purify the hearth. You built a home, but left space for the guardian spirits. Even the layout of a village or the direction of a doorway might be determined by spiritual considerations, avoiding bad luck, channeling good fortune, or respecting the land's hidden energy. Could you live like this? Could you walk through your home every morning with a bow to your ancestors? Could you cook without whistling, for fear it might attract bad spirits? Could you sleep knowing that a wrong word or forgotten offering might bring a ghost to your bedside? Could you believe, not just casually, but deeply, that every shadow, breeze, and silence held meaning? In feudal Japan, the spiritual world was not metaphor. It was truth, not because it was proven, but because it was lived. In the modern world, manners are often considered a matter of politeness, saying please and thank you, offering a seat to someone elderly, holding the door open when appropriate. But in feudal Japan, etiquette wasn't just good behavior, it was survival. Every glance, bow, step, and word was part of a finely tuned social code that governed not only interactions between classes, but between neighbors, within families, and even between strangers on the road. To live in feudal Japan, even for a single day, required more than following the law or doing your job. It required navigating a labyrinth of unspoken rules with perfect precision. One wrong move could bring embarrassment, shame, or even punishment. Etiquette permeated every layer of society. It began at birth, with how a child was held in the arms of its mother, and it continued until death, dictating how one was mourned, cremated, and remembered. The way you addressed someone, the way you sat, the way you handed an item to another, these were not random cultural quirks. They were essential indicators of respect, loyalty, humility, and social awareness. And every single person in society, regardless of class, was expected to know their place and behave accordingly. For example, let's say you were a commoner encountering a samurai on the road. You wouldn't make eye contact. You'd bow, at the correct depth and for the correct length of time, and step aside without speaking unless spoken to first. If you failed to do this, you risked being accused of insubordination or disrespect, which, as mentioned earlier, could result in punishment, sometimes physical, sometimes fatal. A mere moment of hesitation or a poorly executed bow could be seen as arrogance. And bows were just the beginning. The depth, speed, and number of bows varied depending on who you were speaking to, your own status, and the context. A shallow bow might be used for a casual acquaintance of equal rank. A deep, slow bow, with the head lowered and the back kept straight, was expected when addressing someone of higher rank or during formal proceedings. If your timing was off or your gesture seemed too casual, you risked offending someone without even realizing it. Even seating arrangements were governed by social rank. In a meeting or during a meal, the camisa, or seat of honor, was always placed farthest from the entrance, usually next to a scroll or alcove. The shimoza, or lowest seat, was closest to the door. Guests were expected to wait to be seated rather than assuming their place. Sitting in the wrong spot could imply a misunderstanding of your position or, worse, an intentional display of pride. Dining etiquette was equally demanding. Before eating, one would say itadakimasu, a phrase that both expressed gratitude and showed spiritual humility. You wouldn't begin eating until everyone had been served and a superior had taken the first bite. You'd pick up your rice bowl with both hands, never stab your chopsticks into your food, and certainly never pass food from one pair of chopsticks to another, an act reserved solely for funeral rites. If you did this by accident, you would likely see your host's face stiffen in alarm. And speaking of food, you wouldn't pour your own drink. Instead, it was proper to pour for others, especially those of higher rank, as a sign of respect and attentiveness. If someone poured for you, you'd hold your cup with both hands and bow slightly in gratitude. Remaining passive or inattentive at the table wasn't just rude, it was seen as a failure to recognize and uphold social harmony, one of the cornerstones of Japanese cultural philosophy. Speech etiquette added yet another layer of complexity. Language in feudal Japan was deeply hierarchical. The use of honorifics, humble forms, and respectful verbs depended not just on who you were talking to, but on who you were talking about. You couldn't refer to your own parents in the same way you would refer to someone else's parents. Even the word you was rarely used directly. Instead, people used titles, roles, or circumlocutions to avoid presumptuous familiarity. A merchant speaking to a samurai would use kigo, the highest form of respectful language. Misusing it was more than a grammatical error, it revealed ignorance or, worse, disrespect. Imagine trying to navigate a conversation where every verb you chose, every noun you included, every pronoun you avoided mattered, and where a slip of the tongue could redefine your entire relationship with the listener. You wouldn't speak casually unless invited to. You wouldn't raise your voice. And if you laughed too loudly, you might be seen as vulgar or lacking in discipline. Even walking had rules. In the presence of someone higher in status, you would walk behind them, never beside them, unless invited to do so. If you were a servant or apprentice, you might walk several steps behind, eyes lowered, hands folded or occupied in some useful way. Standing idle, fidgeting, or letting your arms hang too loosely could be perceived as sloppiness, an offense not to personal dignity, but to the household or institution you represented. Within the home, etiquette guided how rooms were entered and exited. Doors were slid open with the left hand while kneeling, to show humility. You would announce yourself softly, remove your shoes at the threshold, and never step on the wooden sill. To cross the sill improperly was to bring outside impurity into the home. Floors made of tatami were sacred. Dragging one's feet, stepping with shoes, or placing dirty objects on them was taboo. Even the placement of a guest's shoes in the genken entryway was a subtle but meaningful act, with toes pointed outward to facilitate departure and imply that the guest was free to go when ready. And if you thought that silence was always safe, think again. When to remain silent was as important as when to speak. Silence could show respect, agreement, shame, or uncertainty. It could be polite or passive-aggressive. It could give someone the space to express themselves, or, if held too long, signal defiance. Reading these moments required social intuition that took years to develop. And if you were a foreigner or newcomer to a community, you wouldn't be granted the benefit of the doubt. Marriages, births, and funerals each came with extensive ceremonial etiquette. A wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a carefully staged act of social harmony. The families met in prearranged formations. Gifts were exchanged according to strict customs. Meals, seating, even the direction the bride and groom faced during the ceremony had meaning. If any step was skipped or done incorrectly, it could sour relationships for years to come. Funerals, too, followed precise steps. Attire had to be black, subdued, and unadorned. Bowing to the family of the deceased had to be done with exactly the right solemnity. Too deep, and it looked theatrical. Too shallow, and it seemed insincere. Attending the wake, offering incense, participating in memorial chants, each act followed a time-honored pattern. And if you failed to observe it correctly, people would notice. They would whisper. Your mistake might even be spoken of at later family gatherings, a tiny fracture in your reputation that could grow larger with time. Even gift-giving, a seemingly generous and universal gesture, was highly codified. Gifts had to be wrapped appropriately, presented with both hands, and chosen with care for their symbolism. The wrong kind of flower, number, or color could accidentally suggest death or misfortune. For example, gifts given in pairs were associated with happy occasions, while items in sets of 4 could suggest death, as the word four sounded like the word for death, sure. You could offend someone simply by giving too nice of a gift, implying they couldn't return the favor, or by not giving one at all, which could be seen as neglect. Now imagine yourself navigating this world with modern instincts. You might speak too directly, laugh too loudly, touch someone without invitation, or gesture with your chopsticks. You might sit before being offered a seat, fail to bow deeply enough, or pour your own drink. None of these would feel like crimes. But in feudal Japan, they would mark you instantly as crude, unaware, and possibly disrespectful. And what would happen then? At best, people would avoid you. You'd be gently pushed to the edge of conversations, your name rarely mentioned, your presence ignored. At worst, your mistake could provoke offense, especially if it involved someone of higher rank. You could be reprimanded, fined, or dismissed from employment. Your family might be embarrassed. Your name might circulate in whispers. You might never be invited back. Because in feudal Japan, manners were more than politeness. They were the glue that held society together. And in a world so tightly bound by ritual and respect, a single misstep could unravel everything. As the last light of day began to fade over the tiled roofs and thatched homes of feudal Japan, a different rhythm took hold of the land. The noise of the market softened, the clang of tools fell silent, and the shadows stretched longer over the hills and rice fields. But nightfall in this world was not a time for true rest or leisure. It was a shift, a moment when the world became quieter, yes, but also more uncertain. Because in a society so deeply shaped by ritual, hierarchy, and hardship, even the dark came with its own rules, dangers, and quiet burdens. In feudal Japan, the night was not a peaceful reward. It was another trial to endure. For most people, The day ended with the same kind of urgency that had started it. There was no television to unwind in front of, no overhead lights to extend your productivity, and no secure feeling of locking a solid door behind you. Instead, the first task at sundown was preparation. Oil lamps were lit carefully and sparingly. Oil was expensive, and light was rationed as much as food. A single flickering flame in a hanging lantern or a shallow dish might be all a family had to illuminate their home. It cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, making everything feel both intimate and uncertain. Homes were not well insulated. The paper walls, shoji, were beautiful in the daylight, but they offered little privacy or protection from the elements once darkness fell. Cold drafts slipped through even on calm nights. Insects found their way inside, especially in warmer months. And in winter the chill crept across the floor, biting at bare feet and fingers. People huddled together around an irori, a sunken hearth that doubled as a heat source and a place to cook a final meal. The smell of smoke clung to everything: clothes, bedding, hair. It became a background presence, as natural as the sound of frogs or wind in the trees. Dinner, if there was enough food to make one, was often a repetition of earlier meals: rice, miso, a few preserved vegetables, and maybe a dried fish if supplies allowed. Families ate slowly, quietly, offering thanks to the ancestors before and after. Conversation was subdued. The weight of the day had settled in everyone's bones. There were no distractions, no performances, no devices to pull attention elsewhere. The room flickered with firelight and the soft rustle of straw bedding being prepared for the night. If you were a farmer, your tools would be cleaned and stored. If you were a merchant, your accounts might be tallied in the dim light, ledger lines double-checked with aching eyes. Artisans sharpened blades, repaired sandals, or patched worn robes while the fire still burned. Nothing was wasted, not time, not energy, not light. Outside, the world belonged to another set of figures. Guards and patrolmen known as Yuriki or Dashin walked the city streets and village roads, enforcing curfews and investigating disturbances. In larger towns, gates were locked after dark, and travelers caught without the proper papers could be arrested or turned away. The streets, once alive with vendors and townspeople, now echoed with the clop of sandals on packed earth and the distant barking of dogs. Torches cast long shadows against the walls, and every corner felt like a secret waiting to unfold. Criminals, too, moved under the cover of night. Bandits might stalk a poorly lit road, waiting for a lone traveler or an unguarded cart. Thieves slipped into open windows, careful not to alert sleeping families. In some cities, fire was a greater fear than theft. A single ember left unattended could ignite entire neighborhoods. Fire watch towers dotted urban centers, and volunteers kept vigil through the night, calling out the hours with wooden clappers, both a comfort and a warning. Superstition also shaped how people approached the night. Darkness was believed to be the time when Uriai, restless spirits, were most active. These weren't abstract ghosts but deeply personal ones: a woman who died in childbirth, a man betrayed by a friend, a child buried without proper rites. People told stories of pale figures hovering by the roadside, of inexplicable chills in an otherwise warm room, of dreams so vivid they felt like visitations. It wasn't just folklore, it was a living fear. To prevent spiritual intrusion, families placed talismans at the head of their sleeping mats, sprinkled salt at the door, or recited sutras before bed. Sleeping itself was simple but not always restful. Families often slept together in one room, arranged according to age and status. Futons were unrolled onto the floor, padded with straw or thin cotton. Privacy was minimal. Snoring, shifting, whispering children, the crackle of the fire, and the distant hoot of an owl filled the quiet. The idea of solitude at night was a luxury few could afford, or wanted. In a world where illness, theft, or even attack could happen while you slept, closeness meant safety. For samurai, night brought its own challenges. Guards rotated through shifts. Those on duty remained alert in dim corridors, hand resting on their swords. Letters were written by lamplight, updates to a superior, reflections on the day, or philosophical musings meant to be passed to one's descendants. Many samurai followed Zen practices at night, meditation, copying sutras, or tracing calligraphy. But beneath the calm, there was tension. An attack could come at any hour. Loyalty could be tested by a midnight summons. Peace, even in silence, was never guaranteed. Religious life, too, continued after sunset. Monks held evening chants, their voices echoing through wooden halls and temple courtyards. Bells tolled at appointed hours. Candles glowed before altars, flickering in rhythm with the low murmur of prayers for the dead or hopes for safe passage into the next day. Pilgrims often slept near temples, their bodies wrapped in straw cloaks, their walking sticks resting beside them. For them, the night was a time of both reflection and fatigue, their blisters and sunburns reminding them that devotion was rarely comfortable. And for the poorest of all, those without permanent homes or families, night was something else entirely. It was a test. Where would you find shelter? How would you stay warm? Would the guards chase you away? Or would a kind soul allow you to rest beneath an overhang or near a stable? These questions had no easy answers. Sleep, for these individuals, came with one eye open. Night was also a time of deep loneliness for some. Widows slept beside empty spaces. Children whose parents worked late lay awake, waiting for a door that might not open. Soldiers remembered comrades lost in battle. Travelers longed for the familiarity of home. In a society where duty and hierarchy ruled the daylight, emotions often waited until night to surface. There were tears cried into thin pillows. Songs sung quietly beneath breath. Letters reread by firelight until the ink faded. But the night was not without beauty. On clear evenings, the stars shimmered across the sky with breathtaking clarity. Crickets sang in the brush. Lanterns floated on rivers during festivals, carrying prayers into the dark. Poets sat beneath the moon and scribbled verses about fleeting love or the quiet curve of a distant mountain. Even the stillness had rhythm, a breath held by the world before another day began. Yet beneath that peace was always vigilance. In feudal Japan, every hour mattered. If you woke too late, your fields might go untended. If you missed the morning ritual, you might dishonor your ancestors. If you let your guard down too far into sleep, you might not wake to the sound of danger. There was no true break from responsibility, only a temporary pause. So ask yourself, could you sleep soundly in this world? Could you lie down with nothing but a thin blanket and a smoldering fire? Could you rest knowing your family might be called upon in the night to host a guest, fight a fire, or answer to a traveling official? Could you share your space with 5 others, listening to the sounds of breathing, dreams, and murmured prayers? Could you close your eyes knowing that ghosts were real, that enemies might approach in silence, that you were always being watched, by society, by spirits, by your own conscience? Because in feudal Japan, the night was not just an end, it was a test. A quiet, shadowed world where everything you did during the day settled into the corners of your home, where your reputation rested beside your pillow, and where the next dawn would demand you begin again. And so, another day in feudal Japan draws to a close, not just in the fields or the workshops, not just on the narrow roads or within dimly lit homes, but here, in the quiet space where we've traveled together through time. You've walked in borrowed sandals. You've bowed where required. You've waited in silence and worked without pause. You've felt the weight of honor, the stillness of fear, and the ritual of each carefully measured gesture. You've seen how much could be asked of a person simply to survive. And if you're feeling just a little more grateful for your pillow, your privacy, and your modern comforts, then perhaps the journey has been worth it. Feudal Japan was beautiful, yes, but it was also brittle. It demanded much from those within it. Structure gave order, but not always peace. Tradition gave meaning, but not always mercy. And rest, true, gentle, uninterrupted rest, was a luxury many never knew. But tonight you can rest. There are no paper walls around you. No officials to bow before. No ghosts to appease or sandals to mend. You are here, in your own time, with warmth, stillness, and quiet all around you. So let your thoughts drift like lanterns on a river. Let the wind of history carry you gently towards sleep. You've made it through a long day in a distant world, and you're safe now, back in your own. If you enjoyed this journey, we hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to Ancient World Unknown for more calm, thoughtful stories from the past. Let us know in the comments where and when you're listening. Until next time, sleep well, and may tomorrow greet you with peace.